I had a huge ego. I was like, I'm so smart. Nobody can take me down. I'm so smart. But then I went to college. There's no grade inflation. Nobody holds your hand. It turns out that I didn't really know how to study and I didn't really know how to manage a schedule. I think once I lost the regular structure of high school, I really struggled when I went to college.
This is ADHD Aha, a podcast where people share the moment when it finally clicked that they have ADHD. I am here today with Brandon Hogstad. Brandon is trained as a scientist with a PhD in life sciences and works as an AI adoption and implementation coach for professionals and teams. He also co-hosts a dream interpretation podcast called Let's Talk About Dreams and publishes music with his brother Jonathan as the Hogstad Brothers. Brandon, you are a jack of many trades, like so many folks with ADHD. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me here.
Glad to be here with you today. So let's get into it. Let's talk about when you were diagnosed with ADHD. When was that? Was it recent?
It was relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. I was diagnosed essentially back at the beginning of the pandemic, so about 5 years ago. I was fortunate enough to be living with my partner, Eleni, who is an ADHD expert.
Yeah. Shout out Eleni, who also happens to work at Understood. We love Eleni.
I didn't really have a whole lot of awareness about ADHD and what it was. I think before I was under the impression that it was just a thing that kids grew out of, which I know is a very common misunderstanding about how ADHD works. Like now I know that about this. When I was a kid, there was like a lot of discussion around like Adderall and Ritalin for children that were very hyperactive, maybe not doing very well in school, things like this. But I was always a kid that got straight A's all through my, elementary school years. So I guess it just kind of went undetected.
Yeah.
But once I started learning about ADHD in my 30s, I started like looking back on my life with a new lens and more clarity, where I was like, oh, that's why I was struggling with those certain things.
Yeah.
So my partner, Lenny, was working on ADHD research for Understood. Her roommate, Kelly, who also has ADHD. I remember they were like chatting between themselves and they were like chat, whisper, 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 looking over at me. I was like, wait, what are they talking about? And then they were like, have you read this book? Maybe you should read this book, Driven to Distraction. And I read the book and it kind of sounded like the story of my life, where I was like, oh my God, I started all these projects and I always struggled with finishing them. I always got really excited about things, potentially difficult interactions with authority. So
I'm going to ask about those later.
Reading this book really helped me get a lens on how I had previously struggled and, started giving me more awareness of how I can manage ADHD now as an adult and professional.
Yeah.
Because turns out ADHD doesn't go away.
No, it does not. Because of, the relationship you have with your partner and the knowledge that you had gained, am I right to assume that like you weren't very surprised by the ADHD diagnosis?
It's almost like a shock and frustration looking back at like, oh, why did I not know this sooner?
Yeah. Sometimes I refer to it on the show and I can't say that I coined it, but like the ADHD grief cycle.
Yeah. Whereas like, oh, I know this now, if only I knew this when I was in college. Because, I mentioned earlier that I had gotten straight A's all through elementary school and all through high school. I was actually the valedictorian of my high school.
Yeah.
I was like riding high. I had a huge ego. And I was like, I'm so smart. I'm so smart. Nobody can take me down. I'm so smart. But then I went to college and I went to UC Berkeley, which is a very intense public school.
Yeah.
There's no grade inflation. Nobody holds your hand. And it turns out that I didn't really know how to study and I didn't really know how to manage a schedule. I think once I lost the regular structure of high school, I really struggled when I went to college. So there were certain topics I did fine in. I did okay in biology. I did okay in chemistry. I did terribly in math, like in calculus.
Yeah. You got your first C in calculus, didn't you?
Yeah.
I'm sure you love being reminded of that. Yeah.
It was and that was like a very stressful time for me. I went from being a big fish in a small pond in my high school to being tossed into the ocean. And suddenly I went to, I was in a school where everyone was the valedictorian. And suddenly I was not special. I was not smart. And I really struggled to like figure out how to get my act together.
Yeah.
I often bit off way more than I could chew. So,
Right. You were confident.
well, I was also very enthusiastic. I was like, well,
Yeah.
I'm going to take 18 units of classes. Oh, wait, there's these other 2 classes that are really interesting. So I'm going to get 20 units. Oh, the maximum is 21 units. I might as well take this one extra meditation class for 1 unit. And then there I am. I'm at the maximum number of units. Of course, I didn't manage my time very well that semester, so I ended up actually failing that 1 unit meditation class because
Yeah.
I made some poor scheduling decisions.
And I always find it interesting. Like there are patterns that I certainly notice on this show of when people start to hit a wall with their ADHD related challenges. I hear a lot about middle school, because middle school is often where people have to, they have multiple classes instead of one teacher. There's a lot more executive function demand put on you. For other people, I hear a lot about college, or I hear about post-grad, or I hear about like when they got their first promotion at work and then they had to manage people and other people's schedules instead of just their own. And then a lot of times for women, it's about that moment when, oh, I have a kid now. And oh, my kid has ADHD too. Oh my gosh, I can't handle this. So your moment, it sounds like you get to higher education and just like a little bit of executive dysfunction coming into play there.
It took a lot of experimentation on my part to figure out how I could actually learn in that environment. And one of the key things for me was that I was kind of struggling in my science lectures. I was studying molecular biology, but once I started working in laboratories, that's where everything started clicking in my mind. So I realized, oh, I'm much more of a hands-on learner, doing DNA sequencing and doing experiments. Once I started doing hands-on lab research, that's when all of the lectures started making a lot more sense to me. But if you give me an experiment and a mentor to talk through, to say, hey, okay, this is what the goal is. Like, what do you think? And then we start brainstorming and we come up with different ideas. I get to ask questions. What if this? What if that? It became a much more conversational way of learning rather than just sitting and passively absorbing in a lecture hall. My grades did go up over the course of my undergrad.
If I remember correctly from our pre-interview, was this in college when you banned yourself from starting new projects?
When I went to grad school, I ended up doing my PhD in biomedical sciences. I was studying immunology, and I ended up joining a lab. It was a pretty big, famous lab, and I had to be very independent, and I was super excited, enthusiastic, and I started, I don't know how many, like in my first year, I started probably like somewhere between 6 and 9 projects. Looking back, I was like, oh, there's just so much starter energy, but the doing energy, that focus to actually carry out a project to completion and deciding what projects are actually worth doing. I kind of had to learn that through my PhD program. And at a certain point, I did ban myself from starting new projects because I knew I needed to focus in order to finish my PhD.
That's a lot of self-awareness when you don't know yet that you have ADHD.
It was a lot of hard-won self-awareness because a lot of this was learned through failure, eventually realizing the pattern. And the funny thing was that my PhD mentor, in many ways, she and I were very similar. We're both very big ideas people. We love brainstorming. And when we would talk, we would go through something. We'd say, "Oh yes, and how about that? And how about that?" And then it would kind of like grow the palette of what could be happening. When looking back, I probably needed somebody that was much more counterbalancing to my abilities, that can like tone me down and help rein me in, rather than continuing to expand ever outward and spiraling into less and less focus.
What's the wackiest idea that you wanted to try that you didn't?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I had so many. At the time, we were looking at these cells that are kind of like security alarms of your immune system. If it's doing all these fancy things, then we could make drugs to target this. But we just had so few tools to actually do that. I would have had to build all of the tools to study this. I probably would have had like a 10-year PhD at least if I wanted to pursue that. I would have had to make mice. I would have had to make antibodies. I would have had, if I wanted to make drugs, like it was just a highly overly ambitious project that really didn't go anywhere.
You would have had to make mice, like clone mice?
Pretty much, yeah. So like I worked in a laboratory where we did a lot of genetic engineering of mice.
Got it.
It was really fun and interesting, but it's also like all incredibly difficult and time consuming.
And by the way, I just want to say for everybody listening, there are haters out there who say that people with ADHD aren't smart. Everyone, I would like you to introduce you to Brandon. You mentioned earlier struggling with authority. Can you give us a little insight into what you were referencing there?
I haven't always had the smoothest relationships with managers.
So this is an adulthood thing. This isn't a growing up thing.
Correct. So when I was a kid, I was like a pretty goody two shoes teacher's pet. I was always like friends with the teachers. I was always getting good grades. When I became an adult, I think one of my earlier issues with authority became like I was working in a laboratory as a technician, and there were some postdocs that were just like real jerks. And when somebody's a jerk to me, I do not like to pretend and play nice. I think it's a very common phenomenon. People with ADHD have a strong sense of justice. So when there's like a feeling of injustice, then, kind of like all bets are off. Like I would get really angry and, do everything I could to like not work with that person who's treating me poorly.
The strong sense of justice, you're not the first person who's brought that up with me. What do you think the connection to ADHD is? I mean, obviously we're just speculating here. I'm curious to get your thoughts. You were a valedictorian after all, so I feel like we can you can solve this for me.
So I'm gonna put on my kind of wackadoo brainstorming hat where I'm gonna start making connections that might not make sense, but I'm just gonna
brainstorm
here. So ADHD is about dopamine regulation in the brain. It takes a lot more stimulus to get dopamine responses from people with ADHD brains. But when they do get that response, essentially like once you get past that threshold, the reaction that you do get is strong. And I think that's where the switch flips between being totally uninterested in something and then once you cross that threshold, you're hyper-focused. So I feel like this sense of justice is also linked to this phenomenon of hyper-focus, where it's like things are fine, but then once you see something's wrong, it's like, hey, I need to fix this. And also, I think this is probably linked to empathy when somebody has strong feelings of empathy for others, or if you perceive that there's an injustice happening to yourself or to others, then I think it activates that hyperfixation on solving the problem and like resolving resolving that injustice. That's my thought.
I'm buying what you're selling here, Brandon. I have this really vivid memory of growing up and being with like a babysitter on my street. And I remember getting so fixated on something one day and getting so angry at the babysitter and just being like, it's not fair because you said this yesterday. And today you're saying this. And I just, the fact that I'm even recalling this just means like how deep of a groove it made in my brain. I could not let it go. And I remember being frustrated for like a week about this. And I also remember the babysitter just being like, just let it go. Just move on. And it just like, it got to me. I remember I couldn't sleep that night.
Yeah.
Because I was so frustrated. Yeah. This hyper-focus, hyper-fixating on, like, I noticed this, but you didn't.
I think that might be one of the connections.
We solved it. I mean, yeah, sure.
Let's
there
publish
might
a paper
be.
On it.
Let's publish a paper. Yeah, I know. You're like, there might be more to explore. I'm like, no, I think we got it. I think that check. We got it.
Problem solved.
I want to hear about your dream interpretation podcast. First of all, any connection to ADHD and dream interpretation? It's okay if the answer is no.
I would say yes. Thus far, the guests on our podcast are mostly our friends, and a lot of them are, I would say, neurospicy of various varieties. And then I think that my ADHD actually fuels my dream interpretation superpower. Because I think that the way that my brain works is I'm able to make connections between different symbols, and my brain kind of like recognizes these different patterns that other people might not necessarily latch onto as readily. And like once I see a little inkling of a connection, I kind of grab onto it and I talk it through. And I think that my ADHD helps with that.
Okay, I'm going to tell you something that I dream about often, and I always have since I was a kid. And if I'm going to die tomorrow, just don't tell me. Just lie, okay? Okay. No, I often will dream about being on a giant tundra alone. And it's like icy and cold. And I shout, and I feel like I'm being so loud, but it comes out as a whisper. And nobody can hear me. And it comes with this sense of frustration. It sounds kind of dire now that I say it out loud. People are going to start to worry about me. What do you think, Brandon?
Well, I wouldn't be too worried because I think the type of scenario you're describing is like super common. This image that you're describing in many ways is very unique and specific. And I think that's one of the interesting things about dreams is that the images that we generate in our minds when we're asleep are very unique to each of ourselves as individuals. The visual lexicon that you develop throughout your life informs those images. So like the visual language that you have in your dreams, there's going to be some overlap, but there's also going to be unique things to your situations. I haven't heard of anybody talking about a tundra, but I have heard of people describing situations in which they're alone and isolated, in which they try to use their voice and they can't. The way the dream interpretation works is often I'll listen to your description and then I'll reflect back some potential interpretations. It kind of has to pass the gut check. So you're standing on a tundra, you're feeling frustrated and alone, you're trying to express yourself. What I'm hearing is that, there's the feeling of isolation. When we think about voice in our dreams, it's the way that we communicate with others, right? And if our voice goes unheard, that can be a very isolating experience. I would be curious what else was happening in your life during the times that you had this dream, because my guess would be that, there was something that happened where you're just feeling very stuck and isolated, whether it's like struggling to do something, whether it's in your family or at work and you're just not being heard.
Yeah. I don't remember the exact, and we probably don't have time for me to go into all the many times that I've had this dream, but I think that if I, situationally, there were probably multiple times when I was going through something like that in my life, and then I had this dream. Yeah, but I remember like such a frustration and almost feeling like something was watching me from like an orb above. I'm like, why is no one doing anything? Yeah, maybe it's related to the sense of justice. We can add this to our paper. What would you say is the most important thing that you've learned about ADHD as it relates to your life?
Having ADHD doesn't mean I have brain damage. One of the things that I would get into beating myself up is like when I'm struggling with keeping things together, when I'm struggling to keep all the balls in the air, all the plates spinning, I often will start beating myself up and feeling like, I can't do all of this. I have brain damage. Like I'm a dysfunctional human. And honestly, like I think the most important thing that I've learned is that like, honestly, it's okay. Like everybody struggles with certain things. I can do certain things to set myself up for success. And then some days I'm just going to struggle.
You are very accomplished in many ways, Brandon. And in particular, you are very academically accomplished. I think it's a good reminder to folks with ADHD from all walks of life, for everything that they do, that like, no matter how good everything looks on paper, when you have ADHD, a lot of these struggles are really universal, right? And there's something comforting in that people aren't alone. Brandon, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Nice to chat with you.